Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Contemporary Issues Sunday School class on August 4. It's August already, rolling along quickly this summer, it seems. Well, today we are going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are so glad to have Professor Peter Van Arsdale today to describe to us what this is. I think a lot of us assume we know what DEI is. We've heard of it roughly, but don't know a lot about the details. But I understand it is a policy, a program to try and diversify, get more variety in our companies and government and other aspects of society. And we will talk today not only about the positive aspects, but about the controversy too, because there's probably no perfect way to diversify and get our country happy with the way we do it. Can't please everybody, but it'd be a good discussion. Okay, with that, our usual announcements. Zoomers, please mute yourself on the lower left corner of your screen when you're not speaking. And we are recording this for future playback on YouTube. We have several people here who said, I wish I could be here this morning, but can't. So we are glad to have a recording. And today, as usual, when we're discussing social issues, please be kind in your comments. It's easy to be snarky and derogatory towards one side or the other in political discussions, but this is not the place for that. So we appreciate your cooperation with that. Okay, we always take a moment to talk about something in the news or any announcements people would like to do before I introduce our speaker and our topic. Anybody been watching the Olympics close this week? Call this Simone Biles show. I think gymnastics probably takes up 80% of the coverage of and it certainly is exciting. I kind of like to see the horses and the fencing and a little bit of other things too. And they have been on there, but they're not in prime time.
Steve,
They're in the during the day.
They're in the day, okay,
Steve,
good to know.
Steve,
Yes, sir.
I think it makes us all proud to be American.
Yeah.
Yes, it
To
is.
see the gold medal.
Yes, it is.
And to see the diversity and the hugging, the
Yeah,
cheering, go USA. I
yes.
think you're proud to be an American.
Good point. Good point, Gene. Proud to be an American. That's right. Yes, ma'am.
The one thing that, wow, that was really cool. Well, I've been impressed by the fact that whether they win the gold, the silver, or the bronze, they're still proud. It doesn't matter. It's like those three, it's like, they don't, I got a medal, and I've been really impressed with the way that they handled that situation, so they're just proud. And that's me.
Yes. Okay.
Well, at first, they're disappointed they didn't get the gold, and then they realize, oh, I got a medal.
Yeah.
And then
Yes. Okay. Any other announcements? Welcome to first September 1. We are going to have a potluck at the Puning's house. You're all invited. And what time? 5 o'clock? Okay, I'll send out an email.
People to sign up.
To sign up for things. And thank you for doing that. That'll be nice to get together. Okay. All right, Professor Peter Van Arsdale is going to speak for about 30 minutes. And then we will have 20 or 25 minutes for discussion. And we hope you'll bring your thoughts here. Let me introduce Peter Van Arsdale for those who are not familiar. Recently retired professor of anthropology and international studies from the University of Denver. He has been busy in his research and teaching and travels to Africa, Asia, and all around the country as an anthropologist. He's written many books, including a bestseller in 2006 called Forced to Flee. And I've read a couple of his books. I encourage you to go on Amazon or somewhere and Google his name and look at his books.
Because that'll enhance my royalties.
It will help his royalties.
Just
That's
teasing,
right.
just teasing.
He is currently on the affiliate faculty at Regis University. And in 1978, he co-founded the Hospice of Denver too. So his service is wide. We are so thankful to have you here today, and tell us about DEI.
Sure will. Well, thanks. It's great to see you folks. Thanks for coming. I know many of you, some I don't know as well, but it's a privilege to be a member of this important class. And following in the good work of Steve and Ron, who have been very inspirational, and I've been reflecting on their good work. I also want to comment on the inspiration of several other people who are here today who've been guiding my thinking, whether they knew it or not, behind the scenes as I prepared my talk for today. And those people are my dear wife, Kathy, who's right there, Keith Winkle, who is here, Jean and Mary Dawson, who are here, who I've had many nice chats with recently on related topics, and Sharon Burbank, who I just got to know. Where are you, Sharon? Who I just chatted with last week, and who made a critically important comment then. So thanks to all of you, and it's important that your goodwill and insights are reflected in what we share. Well, let's begin with a bang. There are several mantras, slogans, or what are technically called initialisms. They're not acronyms, but initialisms that are out there that recently have captured our attention in the United States. And those include MAGA, M-A-G-A, Make America Great Again, CRT, Critical Race Theory, DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, which we're going to talk about today, and that phrase, deep state, which we also hear about. All four of those are powerful, robust, controversial sorts of things to many folks, aren't they? Let me just start with this point. MAGA is based on a cult, to use Brett Stevens' phrase, a cult of personality through Donald Trump. Many people use it. Many people are interested in it. Many people, like myself, basically despise it. But it's based on a cult of personality, whereas CRT, Critical Race Theory, and DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, are based on an understanding of processes that we're dealing with and wrestling with. Not always effectively, sometimes up, sometimes down, but those are based on processes. That's why they're helpful. CRT and DEI, even if they cause some controversy or disagreement, are helpful in that regard. In my view, something like MAGA, to toss out a phrase like that, is entirely unhelpful. The deep state, well, we could, some of Ron's points that he's made recently, of course, have touched on issues associated with that, so we won't go into that, but this is another one of those phrases that's tossed out. So the initialisms, CRT and DEI, I think are very important. So today we're wrestling with DEI. So I hope you'll look at the first handout, the one that has the text on it with the 6 bullet points. And let's just go through that. That's sort of an introductory overview that I hope you'll appreciate.
Peter, excuse me, our Zoomers don't have the handout or
Oh, well,
slide.
true.
Would you review what's on? there?
But I'm going to review them in detail
Okay.
as I go. That's right. I sure am, Steve. So on the handout, the 6 bullet handout, diversity, equity, inclusion, the words you know, are organizational frameworks reflecting processes allowing such things as discrimination, identity, disability, and other issues to be systematically addressed. When we think about them as organizational frameworks reflecting processes as opposed to some kind of a ominous word that hits you between the eyes, we can make some headway. These 3 frameworks represent values. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are values which can be tackled through the 3 Ps that I also always like to use, because they're easy to remember and they relate to really the work we do through people, through programs, and or, to get back to Steve's earlier point, through policies. Now, the second handout that you have is my tree of rights. And so if you would turn to the diagram, be so kind. I developed this, speaking of diversity, with the input of a number of other people, interestingly, including African people, while I was in South Sudan 12 years ago. I used their ideas as well as many other people's ideas in developing what I'm honored to say has been quite a widely distributed and well-received metaphor. So that is a metaphor, a visual metaphor about human rights. My point is this, and we'll talk a little bit about the metaphor. To understand DEI, I believe you need to couch it within the context of human rights. And then there are other, of course, spinoffs from that. If we think about human rights, DEI can spin out of that, in my opinion. Now, looking at that page, what happened to my page? Somebody took my copy. It was, there we go. Thank you.
Sorry.
Peter, I gave you two.
I know, and they both disappeared. I mean,
You didn't get one of these? Got some on it? There they are.
there's more copies of the first page with the bullets and of the metaphor of the tree. There are more copies if you'd be so kind as to circulate them to a few of our friends. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, of course, of course. So let's look at this tree of rights. Some of you have seen it before. So for those of you who have, bear with me, but for those of you who haven't, I hope you'll appreciate it. I developed this again with the aid of other people, including African people, to serve as a tool, as something that would be helpful to consider human rights, and today to complement our discussion of DEI. Briefly, the tree was inspired to me by Africans because Africans love to think of trees as metaphors for things they do in life. So I was honored that they inspired me in that way. Briefly, at the bottom of the tree in the roots, you notice needs or provision rights. Those are the basic rights that we have to have or we can't do anything else in life, and you'll see what they are. Shelter, food, water, and sanitation. Those are called provision, not provisional, provision rights. They are the foundation for anything else that we could possibly do or want to do. In the trunk of the tree, you notice I put debate and discourse. When we're thinking of something like DEI, we've got to debate it. We've got to engage in discourse. We've got to be open to different perspectives. That's why it's central to the trunk of my tree. You notice I put resources there on the side of the trunk. We have to have resources. They might be fiscal or network or church-based. We have to have resources. Then you'll notice I put on the left side of the tree as we work our way up, values, DEI or values, and on the other side, duties. We have to do things. All of the people that I complimented earlier today, from Ron through Kathy, are talking about and have been talking about doing things, not just talking about things. And that is reflected through duties. And as you move to the right side of my chart, you'll notice on the side, it says obligations as moral drivers. That means if there's something that is addressed or needs to be addressed, for example, to benefit a marginalized person or an at-risk woman or a person with a disability, or as Reverend Mark likes to say, a person who is differentially abled, we have an obligation to act. We can't just talk about it and say, well, good, we talked about it, now let's go have a donut. Now, I did have a donut earlier to inspire me, so that was good, and I might have one afterwards too. A second donut, if things go well. If not, I won't have a second donut. Well, we have to have a little chuckle as we go. So obligations must be engaged, as we all know, not just talked about. On the other side of my tree, you'll see on the vertical, education as an enabling right. There is nothing, as we all know, and we've said it in this class, thanks to Steve, Ron, and so many other good presenters. Be informed, be engaged, be educated. And you know, just as an aside, speaking of diversity and gender issues, which of course are complemented by this DEI issue. When folks have asked me in different lectures I've given about if I had to name a single thing to tackle, if, for example, I was working, and I have had the privilege, in a developing country, in a third world country, most recently in African countries, if I had to name just one thing, there are many things we can do. If I had to choose just one thing to tackle, it is girls' education. If I had one choice and had no other resources, it would be girls' education. I strongly believe that may be one of the singularly most important things to enhance the world, not just the US. Now you notice, moving up the tree, a couple of other words, which my friend Keith Winkle, I think he's winkling at me in the back there. Can I use the word winkle?
Sure.
Oh, yeah, because you're winking, so that must be winkling. Very good. My good friend Keith Winkle and I have been in communication even tomorrow, even yesterday when we were both at the blood bank by coincidence. And he sent me a very nice message, which he shared with a couple of other folks. He's been wrestling with, and I'm paraphrasing, equal opportunity and equal outcome. And he's moved more to a consideration, not that he's not interested in outcomes, but more to a consideration of equal opportunity. Keith, that is exactly what is reflected on my tree. When I say equality, which is on the tree, that's referring implicitly to opportunity. But equity is better for outcomes. Equity has to do with fairness. And what's fair for Kathy, even though we're closely aligned, may not be exactly what's fair for Peter. What's fair for Mary, although she's closely aligned with Jean, may not be exactly what's fair for Jean. Equity has to do with fairness, and resources are differentially applied to help people achieve equity. I'm blessed to have a bit of wealth. Therefore, I don't need as many financial resources as an impoverished person. I mean, that's obvious. So equity has to do with considering the distribution of resources to bring to equitable, not necessarily equal, to equitable outcomes, but equal opportunity. As you move up this chart, and again, I'll just briefly talk because then we'll move on. You notice I have on the upper left branch, freedom from. Those are called negative rights. Freedom from slavery, freedom from torture, freedom from rendition. Rendition, remember, is when a possible perpetrator of something is sent to a black hole somewhere in another country and you never hear from them again, where they may be tortured, imprisoned, or who knows what. That's rendition. Those are what are called negative rights, meaning things we don't do. On the positive upward branch to the right, freedom of, those are called positive rights. Freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of movement. We need to consider both negative rights and positive rights, to consider human rights and to consider DEI. And at the very top of my chart, of my diagram, are the two words dignity and justice. Dignity is reflected, as we see it, anthropologically at least, in the individual. The dignity and respect for the individual, and the key word that goes with that, autonomy. The autonomy and respect for the human body, the human mind, and the human individual, reflected in dignity. Justice, the sister term, is applied more, at least in anthropology, to groups. Justice for a group of people. Justice that you're seeking for example, marginalized Sudanese people now struggling so terribly in Darfur, a place where I worked some years ago. So my friends, with that chart in mind, and feel free to, when we get to the Q&A, to ask me any questions about it, or if you have ideas, please feel free to. It's a metaphor, it's a tool. I want to then move on back to my 6-point handout to the point that to consider these issues through DEI, we have to think about organizational culture. Every organization that's viable has a culture. Now, of course, anthropologists would be excited to use the term culture. We use it all the time when we're looking at different societies and ethnic groups, of course. But our church here, St. Andrew, has a viable organizational culture, reflected in part in the work you folks are doing and the work that other folks do here. Having a class like this that's so vibrant is a part of the organizational culture and the reflection of values of our church. So as we think about DEI, I believe we must think about that in a cultural, organizational, or institutional cultural context. Not so much for an individual, although people obviously are the beneficiaries, but what is the cultural context that can support DEI? The next little point is what I call the AAA paradigm. And I know some of you are members of the American Automobile Association. Congratulations. Steve, for example, is a member. Steve, this is not the American Automobile Association. Sorry to say. But I'm glad you raised your hand. This is the 3 words: awareness, action, and advocacy. A class like this is for awareness through education. Action is doing something based on what we've learned, for example, in a class like this. And advocacy, so by the way, back to action. I mean, if you march in a parade, like the Marade on behalf of Martin Luther King or something like that, that's action. Or if you reach out and help someone at the elementary school that we help, that's action, of course. Advocacy is very important in this way. To be an advocate, I feel, you must be knowledgeable on various points of view. If you are only knowledgeable on one point of view and you espouse that, thank you, Gene, and espouse that only that one point of view, I don't consider that to be an advocate. I consider that to be a espouser. Is that a word? I just invented it. But if you're knowledgeable about several issues and can wrestle with those and discuss them, and then of course speak out on the one you most believe in, you could be an effective advocate. And many of the people here are. But awareness is good. Action is good. Maybe some of us can do all 3. And then the final point, which based on my newest friend in the audience, Sharon Burbank. Where are you again, Sharon? I know you're nearby. Her point is, we chatted last week after class about looking at diversity more widely, not just in the US, but beyond, looking at what various institutions are doing to hire people who work on diversity programs, including the universities. Yeah, and look at what other societies have done. I have the privilege of working in a number of societies, and while they don't all tackle it the same way we do, there's a lot we have learned, and that I've had the privilege of learning from African, Asian, and Latin American societies about diversity. So, my friends, that is a brief overview, and thank you for listening, of my 2 handouts. Now, a few other points to make. A place where Rotary, that I'm a member of, is playing out in most recent months, I'm tickled to say, and several of you are involved in Rotary, is DEI. DEI through our district here at Rotary is called District 5450. There are hundreds of districts around the world and well over 1 million Rotarians around the world. Our district here in Metro Denver and Northeast Colorado has just, in the last few months, established a district-wide DEI committee. Well, it makes sense. Rotarians are interested in humanitarian work and services. Many of you know, as are other groups like Kiwanis, Lions, etc. And so the fact that we've now finally started a committee, not only in some of the clubs, I belong to the Denver Southeast Club, but for the district as a whole, is a real plus. And I'm honored to be a member of that district-wide DEI committee. So I'm using this Rotary development just to complement our interest in developments here, because it's a nonprofit organization doing good work. Rotary tackles DEI, particularly through awareness of my AAA paradigm, that first awareness through education, making presentations, but a little bit of action when Rotarians marched in the parade in the last couple of years. That was action and down there in January, benefiting Martin Luther King's memory. So, and a bit of advocacy, somewhat moving toward advocacy as well, but it's still new. But we do work with important folks who give us insights from a diverse perspective, and they include Reverend Leon Kelly, who many of you know, of course, and have heard of, and Hassan Latif, the leader of the Second Chance Center. Both of those are leading African-American gentlemen, very, very fine folks to talk to and work with. So that's one way to get engaged and to get involved, and Rotary's trying to do that and trying to improve in that regard. Rotary's also engaged in the fact that I'm privileged to edit a journal in anthropology, and that journal, which is going to include an article about my dear wife in the near future, among several articles, will also include an article about DEI written by a Rotarian. So you see, we're trying to move this forward and take it an additional step. And in that article that my friend Bill Donahue's writing for our anthropology journal on DEI, he made a couple of key points that you'll appreciate. To work with DEI, it's best to present it from a compassionate, not a compliant perspective. Isn't that terrific, the way he came up with that phrase? Work on it from a compassionate, as you discuss it and debate it and wrestle with it and talk to people who may not like it. From a compassionate, not a compliant, i.e., you must do this, you must love DEI perspective. That can turn some people off. So I really like Bill's phrase, be compassionate about it, not just compliant. And he's written a little bit about DEI in the workplace. So again, speaking of diversity, I think you'll find his statistics that he found interesting. Bill's statistics, about 78% of the Democrat or Democrat-leaning workers that were interviewed in a particular survey said they felt focusing on DEI at work was a good idea. And they found that about 30% of Republican and Republican-leaning folks felt it was a good idea to focus on DEI explicitly at work. Interesting and complimentary, but interesting statistics. And he reports that over 2/3 of Black, Asian, and Latinx or Latino workers also say it's a good idea to focus on this generally at work. So very interesting. So we're looking at statistics. We're looking at data. My wife, Kathy, will tell you, I've always loved data. Even to the point of driving her crazy at times. When we talk about, as we often have as an aside, the distance to the moon. For some reason, I've always been interested in the 220,000 miles plus or minus distance to the moon, but that's an aside. But I do like data. Data is important. The final Rotarian point, my friend Ed Meyer, who is Jewish and a dear friend of mine in Rotary, said this the other day when we talked about DEI. How could any reasonable person not be supportive of DEI? I'm just quoting him. There are reasonable people who probably aren't supportive, but that's what Ed said. I said, Ed, may I quote you to the class? He said, you may. How could any reasonable person not be supportive of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, now we talk about some of the personalities engaged in this enterprise, pro and con. In my view, with Kamala Harris now a candidate for the presidency, we should mention a bit about her. Some of the comments, which I'm sure you folks are aware of, so I'll be brief. In that regard, we talk about a singular issue that's very important to DEI folks, identity. Everyone has an identity. Every person, your identity is phrased in different ways. And your identity, but you have several identities. You can be like me, privileged to be a father, a husband, and a grandfather, an anthropologist, whatever. We all have multiple identities. But your identities are also shaped by what people think of you. It's not just what you bring, it's what people bring, shall we say, towards you, that shapes your identity and how you react to that. Kamala Harris is a woman of Black and Asian descent. Sadly, some folks recently called her a DEI hire. A DEI hire. I'm talk about a ridiculous statement, in my opinion. And recently, again, don't want to get too riled up, but I get a little riled up with Donald Trump. Trump recently said, and I'm paraphrasing, when did she become Black?
When did she turn? When did she turn?
I mean, really? And then at the same, I think that was the same conference where he said, but I love Black people.
Peter, quick question. if you
Please,
could.
please.
By asking if she's a DEI hire, are they really asking, did Biden pick her mostly because she's Black?
Was she qualified?
I think that's the implication.
Sure.
And the implication also is that people who are picked based on race are less qualified in many cases.
That's what
right?
some of the
Because of
implications could be, yes.
experience or test scores in college. And that's
Yeah,
the criticism. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
well stated. You couldn't have said it better, Steve. Yeah, and those, and we have to be open to think about that and wrestle with it. Absolutely, Steve. Another person we should mention, again, on the ominous side, but because it relates to these topics and impacts DEI, is a well-known person named Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes is an ultra-right white nationalist. And interestingly, to show this could cut in different ways, he recently derided J.D. Vance because J.D. Vance's white is of Indian American heritage, and thus their children are of Indian and American heritage. Fuentes derided J.D. for that. Fuentes has often espoused Hitlerian comments. He's a leader of the America First movement. He's an avowed anti-Semite and a PAC, a pack mover and shaker. Why am I spending time on Nick Fuentes? Simply to say that we have to be attentive, be able to speak out and combat people like that, because he has a wide following. He has a wide following.
But Peter, Fuentes sounds Hispanic to me.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so, I mean, there you go, Norley. Yeah, I mean, really.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, now I'm going to go to a positive person. A positive person, from my perspective, is Amy Voth Siebert. She is the inclusion program manager at the Colorado Department of Public Health. So back to my point about institutional culture. Many institutions and organizations, including public health organizations, have inclusion program managers or people with similar titles. Several of the universities do. And so to have a person with that title working on inclusivity seems to me to be a wonderful thing to do and to put money into. But now we must turn on the opposite side to two governors who have done things that diminish such inclusivity in their states. Again, many of you'll know this. Governor Greg Abbott of Texas on June of 2023 signed a bill into Texas law banning DEI offices at state public colleges. There were a number of such offices with personnel diligently engaged in DEI activity. Those have now been banned. He argued that DEI efforts promote racial profiling and that millions of taxpayer dollars will be saved by him eliminating these offices. We could get into a whole issue about racial profiling. It's complex, very interesting to anthropologists and others, but I'm just sharing what he said. By the way, about a dozen states have engaged similar legislative initiatives. I think it's ironic, if I might add this personally, that Greg Abbott, a disabled person who benefited early in his life from programs, is now speaking like this. I'm just going to leave it at that. I think that's perhaps what I would call a sad irony. And of course, I'm glad a disabled person can become a governor. I mean, that's terrific. So, interesting, complicated. The next person I want to mention is Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. You knew I would, so here he is. Ron and Steve in particular knew this was coming. In May 2023, he signed a bill into Florida law banning the state's public colleges and universities from spending money on DEI programs. He said, as actually implemented in the US, DEI better stands for discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination. Those are his initials for DEI. Unbelievable. He also criticized, no surprise, CRT, critical race theory, which I've had the privilege of delivering a lecture on here to the church several months ago. And he criticized gender ideology, saying, quote, that's not what liberal arts education should be. Seems to me that should be central to a discussion and debate on both sides within liberal arts education. Institutions are barred from teaching through Florida. The institutions are barred from teaching identity politics and CRT. So the next ominous thing to discuss, which reflects on DEI, again, many of you folks are familiar with this, is what's called great replacement theory. Great replacement theory is a racist conspiracy theory stating that there's an active effort or movement in the US and perhaps elsewhere to replace white populations. Remember that sad Buffalo, New York tragic killing of 10 folks a while back? The shooter was probably an adherent to great replacement theory. By the way, the well-known and, in my view, ominous French writer Renaud Camus, C-A-M-U-S, was an early proponent of something that led to replacement theory. I'll just briefly mention what I've coined, and I'm not the only one, but briefly, illegal immigrant impact theory. The notion that illegal immigrants and or maybe other immigrants and asylum seekers disproportionately impact negatively our country. I don't believe it. I've looked at the studies, many different sociological, anthropological, and political science studies. None of them have pointed out that they disproportionately negatively impact our country.
How many people in here have immigration in their background?
Everybody here.
Yeah.
Well stated, Alice, and well stated. Well, as I come to a conclusion, so we can open it up to you good folks. Final thing is that interesting process, just to reflect again about it, because it's been pro and con in recent years, affirmative action. That gives us a thought toward DEI too, doesn't it? Affirmative action. And some people are strongly supportive of it. I happen to be, because of the issue of equity, fairness. If a person has come from a disadvantaged background, doesn't have many resources, isn't well connected, then in my view, they deserve an extra push, an extra help. Not from an autocratic perspective, from a grassroots perspective. And that could complement affirmative action. Well, my friends, thanks so much for listening to my various comments. The last thing I'll say is there's the DEI Leadership Institute. And anybody who wants to learn more about it, it's right here in Colorado. I have some outlines of what the DEI Leadership Institute's doing. So should you lead the discussion, Steve? I'll just,
No, go ahead.
I'll listen.
Okay,
You be the leader and I'll be the listener.
Let's ask questions and give comments. Grant.
How does DEI fit into the Olympics and in particular, women's boxing?
Gender issue.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that way. What
I just wondered if it doesn't fit.
does it fit?
Do you ask that question, Grant, because there was just a case of a woman boxer who claimed that her opponent was a transgender, born as a male and was too, muscled and strong to fairly compete against women?
Yes,
Okay.
I mean, that would be diversity, that
Yes.
they are diversifying, allowing that person to box because that person is a trans.
Yes,
person.
yes,
So that's the diversity,
yes.
okay?
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Oh, a good question. I mean, all I can say is this, I support transgender people, as I'm sure most of the folks here do.
Right, right.
I think the challenge is when it actually plays out in sports. You know, that's where I think it's trickier. I have to tell you honestly.
NCAA
so-
women's swimming, another example.
Yeah, so all I can say is the sports is an arena where that's a tough one. I'm glad you brought it up.
That's,
But generally speaking, supporting transgender is a terrific thing to do. There's other comments too, Steve.
Yes, CNN reported that that was not actually true in this case, that this person they thought was transgender was actually born a female. She just was like Serena Williams, heavily muscled, looked very masculine. And so that was not originally reported correctly, according to CNN.
My understanding
Norley.
too, in addition to that, is that there's some sort of genetic test where there's an XY chromosome and. Right. Yeah, it's more like intersex than it is transgender. I mean, nitpicking, but.
Well, and then they're testing the hormonal content and
Exactly.
setting a cutoff.
Yes, but it's an example of diversity. Can it go too far in sports? Is it fair to let people who were born male compete against female of lesser muscle development? Yes, Gene.
As an anthropologist, Peter, thank you. This is so very helpful.
Oh, thank you, Gene.
As an anthropologist, replacement theory and compassion, as you say, approaching it from the point of view. I think Donald Trump, although people may not admit to this, represents the great last white hope. His traction with those elements in our society will resonate to that. Now, we talk a lot about biodiversity, neurodiversity, gender diversity, a diversity plus in today's world. From a point of view of a nation, I think there is a fear on the part of how many will find out that we're going to dilute ourselves as a country as we dilute the manifest destiny that white Western culture has made us what we are. Therefore, as we dilute the DNA structure, it will become weaker as a result. As an anthropologist, do you think that diversity and the multicultural forces that are moving us in the direction of Harris and Vance's wife and so forth, that it will make us actually stronger? Can you give examples?
The diversity,
Yes.
both from a biological, and you're right on the target, Gene, from a biological point of view, we need diversity. That's how humans have become stronger and able to capitalize on what we've done on the earth. It's through diversity, not through homogeneity, it's through heterogeneity. On the biological side, and of course from my side, on the cultural side, diversity, bringing in different perspectives, wrestling with them, not being homogeneous culturally, is a total plus. And so all I can say is, I feel our country has gone in absolutely the right direction as long as we promote diversity, as long as we truly, I even wrote here, Gene, which complements what we've all been saying, diversity in ethnicity, inability or disabling opportunity, gender roles, educational roles, political roles, and your topic of expertise, gerontological roles. Diversity in all those. Wow, what a plus in my view. Yeah.
Jim.
I wish there was more clarity about the term Native American.
Oh,
If you're born here, you're considered a Native American. Then we have what I call the first Americans, the American Indians. That there's no distinction between.
well, could I just comment on that as an anthropologist?
Yes,
If
sir,
I
I'd like
might be.
Who's
That's
a
great.
real American?
Great question. Yeah.
Who is a real?
I've had the privilege of, for 10 years, serving on the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs, but not recently, but this was a couple of decades ago. And so given that service on the Colorado Commission, I got the privilege of working with people who themselves variously call themselves Native Americans, Indians. It's perfectly okay to say to a Hopi person, are you an Indian? Because they'll say, yes, I'm an Indian. That's not a diminishing term for virtually all of the Native Americans I've known. So Native American, Indian, and increasingly indigenous, to think of those who've been here so long, predate the arrival of Europeans and others, the indigenous or first Americans. Canada's done a pretty good job of using terms like first Americans, indigenous Americans, Native Americans. But I say, Kathy says, she and I are both native Coloradans. We were born in Colorado, and we say, when people ask, we're Native American, we're Native Coloradans. So, yeah.
Steve is Native American.
Yes, we have a Native American person in our class, Steve in the black shirt. I want to share with you just a little bit from the Wikipedia page on diverse DEI, if I can, for just a second. It says in 1961, DEI was first introduced by the Kennedy administration and passed as a program to increase diversity in companies and government programs. But it did not include anything like affirmative action or quotas in hiring. And that was an important part of it. And a lot of critical folks who are critical claimed that it went too far when it went into affirmative action and hiring quotas, setting aside so many jobs at a company for minorities, for example. In 1980s, Reagan tried to dismantle affirmative action, but was not successful in doing that. So my question to you, Peter, and to anybody in the audience, do you think that it goes too far to set aside a number of jobs or Supreme Court appointees on the basis of race to try to get more diversity by setting aside a number of positions and just say we're going to fill those with minority people? And then, of course, you have white people who say that's reverse discrimination against whites who are more qualified, have more years of experience. And so there's no perfect answer, but a lot of folks think that diversity is a good idea, but quotas and affirmative action special help is not the way to achieve that.
Well, I'll just say something briefly, because then I know people in our audience would like to say things. So just briefly again, thinking of equity and fairness, and the fact that we differentially have to apply resources to give people the equal opportunity that Keith Winkle has commented on, and the possibility of equitable outcome that I've commented on. We have to look at differential, not same statutes. I'll just say it that way. I'm a little sensitive around numbers, saying, for example, if somebody said, we have to hire 6 African Americans out of the 30 people we're going to have in our office. I'm a little skeptical or cautious about that, I'll have to say. I just go back to the more general point. Can we apply resources? Can we give people a fighting chance? And if they've been down and out, can we help from the grassroots up, give them a little extra boost? But we want to hear what other people have to say.
Okay. What do you think, anybody? Jane, yes.
Well, for me, a retired educator, it all starts with education in the schools. That's where we have to begin. We can't suddenly change at the upper level somewhere, because that's where the problem is. So education is where it begins, in the classroom. And I'm 100% for that.
She says education where it begins in the classroom. Yes, Keith, and I'll come back to Grant.
And I think education and families.
Education and families.
I think EEO quotas, all that stuff. I lived through those, so we all did. I agree, Peter, with yes, if somebody is challenged, we need to help them out a little extra.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get to the root cause, which James talked about. I think to have long-term success, It can't be through quotas and stuff. It's got to go formative in education for kids to grow up, graduate high school. Everybody ought to graduate high school. How can you exist without graduating high school? That's so obvious to us. To a lot of people, that's not obvious. They become a dredge on society, I'd have to say.
Yeah.
But that education, equitable funding and education, to me, is absolutely critical.
So that minority schools are not underfunded and they can't turn out kids as capable as white schools.
Exactly, and it's a long-term thing that's been happening. That is not gonna be an overnight fix, but until we get toward that. In the long term, we got nothing. I believe.
Thank you, Keith. Let me build on that. I had the privilege through Rotary recently to help coordinate a visit to the STEAM Academy of Denver, which is a relatively new educational program that some of you may have heard about, but not all of you because it's fairly new. The STEAM, which stands for, of course, STEM, plus the A in the word arts. So arts are included there too. STEAM, rather clever, don't you think? That's good. Yeah, they got arts in there. So it's not STEM Academy, but the STEAM Academy is run by a friend of mine, an African-American friend of mine, who has also been a Rotarian, I'm glad to say. And while it's still small, they have less than 100 students. It's in Denver. Other people from other neighborhoods beyond Denver even can apply to become students there. Long and short, they're doing some of what we're talking about here. Looking at what we can do for youngsters. Most of the youngsters in the school are African-American or Latinx, which is also a general term for Latino, Latina. And some other Asian and other folks too. But I chatted with some of those students. I'm telling you, again, it's always a privilege to talk to students. As you know, whenever we're a teacher, it's a privilege to talk to students and listen to what they had to say. They were so excited about the STEAM Academy because it is looking at equitable distribution of resources to help these young folks, many of whom come from impoverished Denver homes.
I want to give our Zoomers a chance to, we've got about 5 minutes left. Anybody on Zoom like to comment or question? If you do, just go ahead and speak, raise your hand. Okay, you come on in whenever you want to. Okay, Grant was first and then in the back.
Does diversity, equity, and inclusion involve the percentages of the populations of the United States? For example, I think we saw one here not too long ago where in 15 years, us white people will be a minority, including all of the others. However, whites will be around 50%. Latino will be around, I think, I don't remember the numbers, 25, Asian about 10, African Americans 15. That's been pretty steady for years and years and years. And then the mixed, I suppose, it was really increasing. But anyway,
And Native Americans in a smaller number.
I'm sorry, Native Americans.
Native Americans also an important percentage.
How does that fit into diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, it fits into our discussion. But I like your points, terrific points. All I can say, again, as an anthropologist, as long as we have good people in our country, what difference does it make what their ethnicity is?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Someday there'll come a time when diversity will mean getting white people into your organization.
That's
What a thought. I'm sorry, Frank is first and then Jim.
I do play chess. I'm terminally mediocre at it. But I've also noticed how over the years, I do not think we've seen a world champion in chess versus that is female. And so even though we believe in education, I have not watched education be able to compensate for what may perhaps be a genetic propensity for chess among males,
rather than females. So I feel in the same way that we're witnessing, the athletic question.
Yes.
Male and female, I think in a very narrow field of chess, likewise, we're over the centuries witnessing, a genetic advantage.
That's outcome versus.
That I don't think through, either, any methods of compassion or compliance can be compensated.
Steve, even though
Point.
even though you were joking, I think there is a latent apprehension, shall we say, that there will be a payback time when whites are the minority. And that fuels some of the petrol
Anxiety.
that is behind
Interesting
white
concept,
nationalism.
yes, Gene,
Yeah.
There'll be a payback for white nationalism here, yes, Jim.
Being with 1 minute left, I kind of hesitate to do this, but I like to throw a little bit of problems into the discussion because it seems like we're pretty pure on what we're talking about. My children were raised in the city and county of Denver during the 80s. And during the 80s, the courts mandated busing to achieve racial integration or to achieve racial equality in education in the Denver public school system. My wife at the time and I were quite, being good liberals, we were quite supportive of the whole program. And my children, I think still to today feel that they were unfairly made to bear the burden of the problem that existed in society or in Denver at that time. And they were bused for their entire time in the Denver public school system. Today, neither one of them feel that they benefited from that. Now, I'm not so sure if we just held their feet to the fire that we couldn't get a little bit of confession that they had a little bit broader experience. But their initial reaction is that was a burden that they unfairly had to bear.
Had good intentions, busing to diversify, desegregate, but it was not very successful in the long run, yes.
I respect that, but maybe it was because it was forced. In my situation, I grew up in Indianapolis, where I grew up in a school that was 50% African American, 50% white. And in my middle school, all the way to my high school. And we now, in our reunions, say that we benefited from that. Because I'm not afraid of African American, I mean, some of them were our friends, we get together, but it wasn't a forced busing, it was part of the demographics of Indianapolis, that half of us were in there, so we didn't feel like we didn't get bused, but it was part of our integrated. So, but to that point, I'm wondering with education, maybe young people should have more opportunities like a domestic peace corps, where, they can go and do a number of different things where they will meet different people, rather than being just in their own little community. And it won't be forced, it'll be voluntary, but encouraged. And then they will have these experiences as a young, student to meet different people of different ethnicities.
Lots of different ways to
Steve,
diversity.
Steve, I
Go
don't
ahead,
think
Jim.
it's just white nationalism. I think it's having to share white privilege. I think it's just the uneasiness of having to share white privilege, which so many of us have benefited from. Don't you think, Peter, sharing?
Yeah.
I mean, that's hard. That's hard.
It is hard. It is
Even
hard.
if you're a Christian, that's hard.
So complicated to live in the world today, isn't it? It's really a lot to consider. We are out of time. Thank you, Peter, so much for a good discussion. Next week, I'm going to present on progressive Christianity. I was just wondering, what are we as progressive? We call ourselves progressive in Christian. So if you have any thoughts on that, questions, let me know what you'd like for us to cover. I thought we talk about what our core beliefs are as progressives versus conservatives, how progressive Christianity is growing or not as fast as we would think it would versus conservative Christianity. So share your thoughts with me if you would. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. God, please be with us in America. Amen.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Susan.
Thank you. Good to see you, my friend.
What did you hear the internet say that he was actually? I love the compassion part that included, the word on my heart is humility.
Well stated.
Yeah,
Well stated.
you either come in with your own bias about what other people need, or you're humble and say, what do you need? You learn that as yeah.
Touche.
I wanted that to be expanded. You're talking about compassion.
We had another half-hour discussion on compassion.
Okay, thank you.
Integrate the housing instead of, well, there was some buses. But integrating the housing, that you didn't have to.
I don't know why they keep.
Yeah. Some of that difference.
Yeah.
I can't. You're welcome, my friend. Thanks for coming.